All right, how do y'all feel about adding a second button? So here's what we got to worry about though, right? Pressed is not a good variable name anymore. Why? Yeah, and it's kind of vague. Like, what am I talking about? Well, here's the thing. I don't actually need this variable, right? I could just take this section of code. It's a Boolean. Put it there. And now it's the same thing. But that's not great either, right? Because now the code's kind of cluttered. There's a whole bunch of stuff. So I'm going to undo that. So I'm going to want to change this. What would be a better name than pressed for telling me if the A button is pressed? Well, what does that have to do with the A button? Because I need to communicate that it's the A button. A pressed might be better. So I want to change it, but I'm going to show you the smart way to change it. Put your cursor into the word pressed, and then press F2. Now, if your function keys are not mapped to actions, it'll work, but if they are, you have to press function F2. So either F2 or function F2, and you can...
You're on a Chromebook, alt.
Hopefully you're not on a Chromebook, because you can't run this on a Chromebook. So what this is doing is it's called refactor rename, and it's going to find all the times that this is used. And so instead of pressed, I'm going to change it to A pressed. And now I've got it. So I'm good on A. Let's do it for the B button too. So in order for the B button, what do I need to do? I need a Boolean. I need to give it a name. B pressed is probably a good name. I have to get a value from my joystick. How does my joystick give me information?
A function called getRawButton.
Get raw button.
The parentheses, you're going to put the button ID, which is
2 for the B button.
About the dot.
What about the dot? Yeah. So I need object dot method, pass in the data, and then semicolon. So now if you look at this, it's giving me a squiggle, but it's not a red squiggle, it's a yellow squiggle. The red squiggles are problems. The yellow squiggles are, hey, did you mean to do this? If I hover over it, it says, hey, the value is not used. So I got the variable, I got the value, but I didn't do anything with it. What am I going to do with it?
you're going to do system out.
Ooh, I don't want to do system out anymore.
Smart dashboard.
I want to use smart dashboard now. Yeah, we're going to go smart dashboard dot put Boolean. What's the first part of that? What's the first input?
Key.
A key, which is quotes. Now up here I used A pressed. If I were to write A pressed here, that's going to be, I'm trying to put the value for the B button into the box on Smart Dashboard for the A button, which is absolutely fine. It's allowed, but in order for this to display right, I need to use a different key. So I'm going to use B pressed, make sure I'm giving it the B pressed value, and a semicolon. Does that look right? Let's try it. Simulate robot code. We're going to make sure we're hooked up to driver station. SimGUI, use real driver station, boom. Let's look at shuffleboard. I'll make the B button a little bit bigger. And if I press between A is on, B is on, they're both on, they're neither on. Yours doesn't show the B button? So there's a couple of possibilities. Either you already had another sim running, in which case you need to close all your simulations and rerun it, or maybe you put in the wrong key, but it's probably the sim. All right, any questions on getting the value of the buttons? All right, now, who would be surprised if I told you that that's not the only way to read the button? It happens. What if I told you there are 3 ways to read the value of a button?
I would not be
I
surprised.
would believe you since I you would get it.
So here is, and we're going to look at all 3 of them together just so that we can see it. I'm going to delete the B button code. And I'm going to rename the A variable to just be A. And actually, we'll make it a little better. We'll call it raw A. And we'll call it A raw. The reason for that is because we can also do what's called A pressed. I'm just going to type all these out so we can see them at once. Okay, so these are the 3 different ways to read a button. Get raw button pressed, and get raw button released. Now, when you first hear those, you might think, wait, isn't get raw button and get raw button pressed the same thing? And isn't get raw button pressed just the opposite of get raw button released? It sounds like that would be, doesn't it? So here's the difference. And I'm going to switch over to draw it out real quick. It's okay. So remember before how I've said a couple of times now that periodic function runs about every 20 milliseconds. So it runs right here, time happens, and it runs right here, and from here to here is about 20 milliseconds. Yeah. Well, what happens if I press it right here? So there's a press there, and then I release it right there. But the code runs here and the code runs here.
Unless you're moving extremely fast.
Not really. You know, it could overlap, but you might miss one or the other. If that happens, I'm never going to see that button press. I will never see it. If I'm fast enough, the button press never happens. If I'm using only get raw button, I would miss that entire press. So for that reason, we have a couple of other tools. So that get raw button pressed will actually tell us, has the button gone from not being pressed to being pressed since the last time I checked? Get raw button released says, has it gone from being pressed to being released since the last time I checked? So it's kind of keeping a tally so that even if you don't look at it at the exact right microsecond, it'll still catch that data for you. And if you hover over get raw button, you'll get this pop-up that says, this method returns true if the button is being held down at the time that this method is being called. If I hover over get raw button pressed, it says, this method returns true if the button went from not pressed to held down since the last time this method was called. Get raw button release says, if it went from held down to not pressed since the last time I called this function. So those are the 3 different behaviors. So if I were to simulate this, all right, so if I were to simulate this now, simulate robot code, build successful, hook up to driver station, shuffleboard, build fail, that's not great. If you are quick, you can kind of see the difference in behavior. For example, the A pressed and the A released should happen more or less after each other, right? I don't want this anymore. Let me remove that. Yeah, so you should see generally A pressed and then A released. It can be hard to catch though because sometimes it's just too fast. But A raw is always going to be, what is it doing right this second? But you do see there is a difference in behavior. So a good question is, why would you use released instead of pressed, right? Whenever I write code, I tend to prefer released over pressed because let's say you're driving around and you press the button and oh no, you pressed it too early. Well, if you're using pressed, too bad, so sad, it's going to happen. But if you're using released, you can keep your finger on the button and then let go when you're ready to do the thing. So there's no right and wrong as to when to use them, except I would say you probably never want to use just raw. You want to use pressed or released. And between the two, I would prefer released most often, just as a safety thing. You found the problem? Found the problem.
Finding the problem is the first step. Facing it is the next.
Yeah, writing code is kind of like being the detective in a murder where you're the murderer and the victim, right? It's a really, really handy expression. So that's everything more or less you can do with a button. It's kind of boring. You can read if the button is being pressed, you can read if the button was pressed, or you can read if the button was released. But because it's going to give you a Boolean value, you can do things with buttons that you can do with Boolean values, which opens the door to a lot of possibilities. But that's going to take us to the end today. Next time, we're going to look at the things on the joysticks that are not buttons. Because there are a lot of things on a joystick that are buttons and a lot of things that are not buttons. Before we wrap up, does anybody have any questions about the buttons?
So if you are going to use a button, you should have the raw and then release.
If you're ever using a button in a timed robot, I would recommend get raw button released as how you should work with buttons.